The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Hey guys, and welcome back to another awesome episode of the Lighting Controls Podcast. We have a fantastic guest for you today who's all the way from across the pond. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. Before we jump into it though, let me just take a minute to remind everyone that today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. Check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com. Has all of our episodes, a news feed for the lighting controls industry, and some merch if you want to support the podcast. Additionally, if you love lighting controls as much as Ron and I do, you should check out NYC Controlled, happening in November. I will be speaking there, and there will be some other great presentations, but also check it out for the vendors who will be there and the new technology that they're going to be bringing to showcase for you. But otherwise, until then, let's get into the podcast. So today we've got a guest, Paul Drosihn. Paul is from the DALI Alliance. Paul, do you want to just give us a quick breakdown on who you are and what you do?
Sure, yeah. Hi, I'm Paul Drosihn. I'm the General Manager of the DALI Alliance. That means I generally manage it. I've been in the electronics and technology industry all my working life, which is quite a long time now. And the last couple of decades of that has been in lighting, particularly LED lighting, and now in lighting controls, which I regard as very much the high-tech end of lighting as it is today.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, I think the main reason we wanted you to come on here, but other than the fact that you have so much experience with all of this technology that's coming into our industry, is the fact that you're general manager to the DALI Alliance. And DALI is this four-letter word that keeps popping up in our conversations. And yet, you know, it doesn't seem to have a lot of teeth when it comes to North American markets. And so we wanted to go to the source, get some real facts and information about DALI and everything regarding it. So, I mean, just for the listeners out there who aren't familiar with DALI or may have just heard of DALI but don't really know anything about it, do you mind just giving us a little explanation of what DALI is and how it can be utilized?
Sure, yeah. So, DALI is an open protocol, so that's like a language. It's feature-rich, and it's entirely dedicated to lighting. So it's digital. We kind of phrase it as the language of lighting. So most people say, "Oh, DALI for dimming," but it's so much more than simply dimming. It really is feature-rich. You know, there are other features: color, emergency, sensing, data, and all of that is globally standardized and supporting cross-vendor interoperability, which I'm sure we'll come on to shortly. Mm-hmm. And the Alliance is we're a not-for-profit open organization. We've got 375 odd members around the globe. The greats that you would expect, and everyone that's involved in lighting controls in any way. Thousands of certified products in our database, and we continue to grow rapidly, roughly in line with the market expectations that were set by an analyst that we worked with called Omnia, who predicted 15% compound annual growth rate around 5 years ago, and that's been pretty much nailed on what we've seen in terms of growth of the industry over that time. So that's where DALI is around the world. In terms of using it, I'm sure we'll get into more of it, but it's essentially a lighting control, a standardized and certified lighting control protocol.
So, and just again, do you mind giving us what the initialism stands for?
Okay. D is for digital, A is for addressable, L is for lighting, and I is for interface.
Mm-hmm. So that's what DALI stands for, and basically, you know, what you've encapsulated there is essentially the point that it's an open standard. You're trying to make it the language for lighting controls out there, but not just for lighting controls, other things as well, because it has that capability. And so, diving a little bit deeper into it, how does it have that capability to expand past lighting?
Well, I wouldn't say that we want to expand past lighting. The interoperability piece is interoperability between different vendors. So that's the thing that we focused on. So it's not interoperability with other standards. So it's really, it's dedicated to lighting and it's specialized for lighting. So I wouldn't say it's beyond lighting. The things that it gives can be beyond lighting. So the future-proofing elements, that interoperability brings means that once you've installed a DALI system in your building, you don't need to rip out the wires if you want to make changes to the configuration. You can do that in software. That means that you don't need to rewire the building if you want to change the wiring, change the layout, have a dynamic space, which is very much talked about these days. So in terms of beyond lighting, it's the benefits that it gives beyond lighting. But in terms of the remit, we don't intend to go outside of lighting in terms of the controls features. Its ability to interact with other systems because of the standardized data, formats, and locations. That means that any one of our 375 plus members' products will be interoperable. The data formats will always be the same, so that if you change your building management system or central management system or whatever it is, you don't have to, or if you change a driver or a luminaire to a different vendor, you don't have to have a translation table. So that's a significant benefit. And interaction with other systems, of course, is then readily enabled. So if you use the lighting hub as a central point for your data, then having that data in a standardized format and accessible regardless of the manufacturer gives you a huge advantage if you then want to interact with other systems, for example, HVAC or security systems, safety systems.
So it's not just about, so you're saying that basically the interoperability is possible, but really the focus is on lighting. It's not just, and so I'm curious if you can give us like a visual to imagine how that communication happens. So for instance, like DMX is a streaming protocol. It sends out addresses and intensity values constantly. And that's how it communicates with lighting. Is the lighting listens to an address and goes, oh, I'm address 50, I'm at intensity 100. So how does DALI work in comparison to that?
So DALI is different from that. I mean, it's the same in that it's digital. It's similar in that it has addresses in the drivers that they're individually addressable. The difference is that it's really truly bidirectional. So rather than just being a continuous stream that each of the luminaires listen to and then pick up and go, oh, I'm that one, I need to do that. It's actually talking, both ways. So the brain or application controller, as we call it, will send out commands or information to the luminaires, but it will also listen on the same bus for inputs, be it from a push button or a sensor or whatever it might be, and then send information to the lights to react in a particular way. So there might be a group or a scene that's already set that it can tell them, hey, just go and do this, which is very fast, or it can communicate something individually to all of the lights, one by one. And so, really, and then the lights can communicate back, luminaires or whatever it is can communicate back in the same way. So there's a continuous flow of traffic on the system. think of it more like, rather than a continuous stream, which DMX is, think of it like more like a wireless or wired Ethernet system, where things talk backwards and forwards to each other all of the time.
Right. So basically, it's not that there's continuous information constantly flowing through the system. It's that when a command is sent, that's when there's information, and then if there's a response for that command, it comes back up the chain to the application controller.
Yeah, and vice versa. When there's an input from a sensor or a device, it can be continuously listening. In fact, in the case of a switch or a sensor, then the application controller would need to be listening out for that.
Sure.
But it's not necessarily always communicating. It will only communicate when needed.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, and again, that's kind of a difference between other protocols that are commonly used in North America, where 0 to 10 volt, for instance, there's always a voltage present on the line. It's not technically a protocol, but we call it a protocol. DMX is constantly sending information out. Wireless, I think, is a good point, that it's not really consistently sending wireless signal out. In most cases, it's sending out a wireless pulse of information when that information is needed. However, when you get into larger wireless networks, you do start seeing that network getting saturated with a lot of pulses because of either repeating or consistent signals. So in opposition to that, we've got DALI, which is really, on-demand information that is not saturating itself when you're doing that, And so, when we get to a saturation point, is there a saturation point? And if there is, what does that look like?
Right. So there's a limitation, right? So for each, what we call a subnet, so a single set of DALI devices, you can have up to 128 devices, that being 64 luminaires and 64 input devices, sensors, whatever they might be. And that's the limitation per subnet. So you have to, much like you would build a wireless network or a wired network in your building, you have to think kind of hierarchically if you want to go beyond that. But it's not a limitation per se, because, there are projects around the world. For example, big one here in London, was called Crossrail. It's now been opened as the Elizabeth line, a new subway line across London. And that had around, I think from memory, around 35,000 DALI, controllers in that system. So, just because it's limited to 128 per subnet, it doesn't mean that you can't build big systems.
Right. So, and I would say that also in that regard, DALI functions similarly to DMX in the sense, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, the terminology is DALI loop when you're talking about 64 maximum, and then you got to start over. Is that the correct term?
We refer to it as a subnet, but you can call it a loop if you want.
Sure. So I'll refer to it as a subnet because that's what you're telling me is the more proper way. So a subnet is similar to a universe of DMX in the sense that you can only have so many. However, the one exception to that is that on a DALI subnet, you can literally wire all 64 of all those devices on the same chain of wiring. It doesn't even have to be a daisy chain. And whereas DMX, you can only have 32 devices on a daisy chain, and then you have to start over. And so you have splitters to expand a DMX universe capability. Whereas on DALI, it really is just, you can have up to 64 devices on one subnet, and then that's it.
Yes.
Or 64 luminaires.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, 64 luminaires and 64 input devices as well.
Sure.
So a total of 128.
Right. And so, if you're envisioning that, there is a bit of a difference there, but but the mindset, at least to a degree, is similar between the two. And I'm just trying to find common terminology here for our listeners, because I mean, we've talked so much about DMX at this point, and so I want them to get a good visual of how DALI is. So being that DALI does have similarities and actually some robustness, why do you think that the North American market has had such a hard time adopting DALI?
I think that there's a mix of reasons. I think historically, DALI was quite a European-centric or focused organization. I think maybe, in the past, it was a few people tried it in North America, had some issues, as you would do with any new thing you start to try. Probably gave up. And just said, too complicated, or it's too challenging. I don't want to do it. And maybe the support wasn't there, from the DALI organization as it was at the time, decades ago, right? So it's ancient history by now. The reality is that we've done a lot of things in DALI since then that have changed. We've tightened up the interoperability, we've improved it, we've added features. We've added testing. We've moved from a registration model, which was maybe open to abuse, let's say, for some, whether it be deliberately or just, people weren't as thorough with the testing as they might have been. That's now much more robust. It's a certification program, so the products are tested. They're verified independently by our certification team. So there's a whole raft of differences from how it was then, how it is now. And in terms of the organization has grown dramatically, and we're putting in a lot of resource and a lot of effort to support the region. And we've been listening as well. We've really taken care to listen to the pain points of various organizations that are represented in North America, and taken those on board as feedback of things that we can do, things that we can action, put resource behind it, and those things are very much in progress. So I think it's a dual-edged thing. Why has it not been adopted? Maybe it was challenging at the time. And wasn't well enough supported. So we've tightened up the things in terms of the spec, in terms of the testing, in terms of the interoperability to make sure it really does work. And we're investing in educational and training materials and resources to support people being able to use it.
Awesome. I really do appreciate you helping us sort of demystify DALI for our listeners, right? Like Webster said, it is sort of that 4-letter word in the industry, and it's funny. We've had a lot of conversations on this podcast about interoperability and having an open protocol, and that's always been a big fight, is how do we get there? Well, DALI is there. That is what DALI is, right? So how do we get people to sort of look at adopting that more into the US market? And then on top of that, how many of the devices, right, obviously being based in Europe and in the EU, how many of the devices are UL listed for the North American market?
Okay, so let's deal with the first one first. Is, as I said, we're investing in resource and trying to support the region as best we can. We've hired dedicated resource recently to look after you guys, and I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years listening and attending events and getting the pain points from the industry. So that's the key thing we're doing behind the scenes. In terms of driving adoption and product availability. So we have a database. I don't know if you know that or not. It's probably not widely known. But we have a database where all of the products which are certified live. If they're not in there, then be dubious about the origins of the product, because anything that's DALI we don't certify luminaires, but we certify anything that goes in a luminaire. So if the luminaire is using a driver that's not listed in our database, then I'm not saying it's definitely a problem, but it's certainly worth asking more questions. So that's the one thing. In terms of product availability, we don't make the product, right? Our members, we have 375 today, or at least yesterday when I checked the number. It's it goes up all the time. We're growing like hell. So that tells us that the market is growing, the product base is growing. We in our database we actually added a feature where you can go and select the North American region and check for devices which are deemed suitable for use in North America by their manufacturers. That's about as far as we go. I'm choosing my words carefully there, as you can see, because we don't check if they're UL listed. We don't check that. We rely on the members for the data that they supply into the database. So there might be products out there or listed in the database that are suitable for the region, that are UL listed, but they simply haven't given the data into the database to update that information because it's a process, an ongoing process. So the best answer I can give you in terms of product availability is go to the database, look and select the North America search filter and search for products in that.
And where can people find the database?
It's on our website, which is www.dali-alliance.org.
And we'll have a description. We'll have a link to that in the description of this episode.
Yeah, I'll provide you all the links.
Perfect. But yeah, I mean, so the resources are there for sure, and I'm curious, what the approach to market is, because one person we were talking to a few episodes ago was talking about how the sales environment in North America is very different than the sales environment in Europe. And so I'm curious if that causes any issues with adoption of DALI as well.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. Certainly, I've heard that there are some differences between the North American market and the European market, but there are also a lot of similarities. So, the terminology might be a little bit different. Some of the processes might be slightly different, phases of the processes, but there's still a construction industry. You have a design phase and a construction phase and, kind of everything in between, right? So, but one of the things about DALI that's interesting is that it's really important to think of it, because it's a system, it's really important to think of it as in the design phase. It's not something that you can kind of bolt on later and try and make it work. Right? You've got to design it in. And that's why we're trying to speak to lighting designers, people that are involved in the early stages of the process, in the specification and design elements of the process. Because if it isn't taken care of at that stage, it's pretty hard to come back later and try and shoehorn DALI into a project.
Sure.
So maybe that's one difference that you have to think about is the way of thinking about it and the emphasis on designing it in, really designing it in at the outset of a project, not, do I think about adding lighting controls later, because that probably won't work.
Well, I think that's a really good point with, how we design lighting controls in this marketplace. Lighting controls do tend to be an afterthought with a lot of systems. And so as a result, that really does hamper the ability to think about DALI, because all of the luminaires need to be compatible with DALI. Whereas if, right now, you can assume that the majority of luminaires in North American market are going to be 0 to 10. And so
if they have dimming at all.
If they have dimming at all. But additionally, if you want to do DALI, you need to vet every single luminaire and make sure that each one of them has the ability to communicate DALI. And they might even need a third-party driver to be able to achieve that.
Well, a lot of the manufacturers offer DALI as an option. The luminaire manufacturer offer DALI as an option. The reality is that, because it's not backed in at the design phase, then it's not taken up. So I'm not sure if that's so much of a problem as the thought processes and the design processes. The other way of thinking about this is that obviously DALI is much more than dimming, as I mentioned earlier. So the benefits that it can bring, once it's in there, they're for the lifetime of that building. The energy savings alone, if there's a negligible on cost for DALI, which there probably is, there's probably a small premium. I don't think that's as big as many people would imagine it would be. But even if there is, it's the gift that keeps on giving, right? Because if you imagine that buildings are designed to last multiple decades. So if you have a payback and you have to go for a DALI system and your payback extended by a month, maybe, if hypothetically speaking, then however many years past the payback period of free money, free energy, free money, as well as the other features that it brings in terms of the data analysis that you can have, the ability to optimize the system so you can change things after the building is done. You can change the software, you can optimize areas, you can change the use of the building even, and you don't have to rip out the wiring. You can just reprogram, and change the way things are set up. It really is the gift that keeps on giving. So, but you can only benefit from those if you think about those benefits from the outset, and you make that investment at the outset, because trying to add it on later is much harder. It's not impossible, but it's much harder.
Yeah, and so I mean, going back to that, making sure that you need a plan for DALI, though. What about with retrofits in existing buildings? Like, how does that affect DALI and its ability to control an existing system?
Right. So, I mean, I'm sitting in Europe right now, right? There are a lot of projects around the world that use DALI. And in Europe, we have a lot of very old buildings. And when they are retrofitted, they're retrofitted with DALI. So, it's not impossible. And you have to have the willpower, the incentivization to do it, the understanding that it's going to bring you those benefits, for the life of your building by installing a DALI product. So, but in terms of retrofits, obviously if it's really minimal in terms of the work that's being done on the building, then it's going to be hard to install those different wires, and a wireless solution, which we're also working on, by the way, would be required. But retrofits, there are plenty of them. If you have a look on our website at the DALI Awards, you'll see lots of historic buildings and existing buildings that are being refurbished, as we call it, and they use DALI. The DALI Awards only highlights projects that are using DALI, and there are plenty of them all around the world, including in the US as well. So.
Well, and that's never been disputed that DALI hasn't happened in the U.S. and we've heard from people that it is growing. There is growing demand for DALI, but it just doesn't seem to have the same foothold as elsewhere. And so, like Ron said, it's an open standard. It's pretty much everything we're asking for, at least other people are saying we need, and yet it's still not making traction the way that we'd like to see it. But you're right. I mean, and hearing all of this, it doesn't disagree with anything that we've been hearing. But, as it pertains to DALI, there are still a ton of misconceptions out there in our marketplace. And so I'm curious if you wouldn't mind just bringing up a couple of the ones that hit the hardest to you and maybe address those.
Okay. we're talking about misconceptions or myth busting, if you will.
Yeah, sure.
I think, there's a few good ones. The perception that DALI is too complicated, for example. So it's a system, as I described earlier. It's a system. So it is a bit more complicated than just joining a couple of wires together and expecting something to work. You have to plan. But that's no different from any other new technology. So there's a learning curve there, and I think it's if the systems were really too complicated and too challenging to work with, then the rest of the world wouldn't be using them. Right, we're 3 decades into DALI, and people wouldn't still be installing buildings, with DALI right now if that was really the case. And the other one that goes alongside that is that DALI doesn't work, and I mentioned that earlier, alluded to that as one of the barriers to entry here, is that it absolutely does work. Clearly, all of those projects that I mentioned around the world, they work. Are there problems with some of them? Yeah, for sure. Has there ever been a problem with a 0 to 10 or a DMX installation? I can't imagine, that every single project ever, for everything went smoothly, right? So the key is what we've been doing, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of tightening up that interoperability piece so that you can use 2 manufacturers' products together, from different manufacturers, and they work together, they talk together. So absolutely it does work. We've added more and more features with more and more tests, moving to the certification model to, iron out some of the wrinkles that were in the early days of DALI, perhaps perpetuating those myths. So, it's kind of a case of bringing it up to date. And again, if DALI really didn't work, then nobody would install it.
Right.
Nobody would use it. So the reality is, all of those things. The other thing is DALI is old. This is what I get. DALI is old. It's legacy. And well, it's true. DALI is old. It's been around quite a while. But as I mentioned, we update it continuously. We're currently working. Next year we'll be launching our wireless programs for certification, which will be really game changers in the industry for wireless. But maybe it is old, right? But the reality is it works. It's robust. It's tried and tested. It's proven. There's 3 decades of history there that show, and people are still installing it now. Those buildings that are 3 decades old are being refitted, and they're not ripping out DALI and putting something else in. They're reusing the DALI system that's in there. So it's a benefit. It's not being old is not a problem.
And so, on that point, though, of old and new, though, like there is a new thing that has come out, which is D4I. And I think there's still a lot of mystery about that in our industry, about what it is and how it relates to DALI. And so I was curious if you mind just talking briefly about that.
Yeah. So D4I is it's really DALI 2, but whereas with DALI 2, everything is optional, right? So another misconception is that everything DALI is inside every single DALI drive, right? Which is not the case, because you wouldn't want to put emergency into features into every driver, and color control, which would require at least 2 channels, and it just doesn't make sense, right? So in DALI, everything is optional. You pick and choose the features as befits the application. And what D4I does is it says, right, okay, we're going to have a mandatory minimum set of features, which will be in all D4I products. And that's some set of data. It's information about what the luminaire is, the energy usage data, and diagnostic data. And in addition to that, it's also power. So we specify the power. And what that gives you is that it means that D4I is kind of plug and play, because you've got the power and the data in every single one of them at a minimum. You can have the other features as well. You can specify those in, but at a minimum, you've got those in every single D4I device, and that improves the interoperability, right? Because it means that they've all got those feature set. What it also does is that at luminaire level, it means that if you want to have a standardized connector system, for example, we work very closely with Zaga, then you can have this interchangeability or interoperability. Be careful what I say about interchangeability. It means something else. But you can have this plug and play capability to install. Maybe you put in standardized luminaires which all have D4I in, but you don't want sensors in them to start with, or you don't want control devices in them. And then a few years later, you want to upgrade your system. And if you've got a standardized connect system and a plug and play system, you can add the sensing, or you can add the control, or you can add a combined, network lighting controller and sensor all in one at the luminaire level. So D4I is really well suited to what you guys call luminaire level lighting control.
Well, so we're almost out of time here, but I just kind of want to package up what we've got here because this is really interesting stuff. This is, really kind of addressing a number of things that we've talked about on this podcast before. And hopefully our listeners really kind of gotten a lot out of this, because it really is important to pay attention to these things. And if you start talking about something in negative terms, which a lot of people in our industry, especially in North America, like to do about DALI, get informed. Find out the truth, find out the reality of the situation. And so when it comes to DALI, DALI is an open standard for luminaires. And the point of it is to create a common language for luminaires to work with each other and with systems, and have a platform that can be recycled and reused and installed for the purpose of longevity, as opposed to other systems that might be something you have to gut every single time you want to revamp a space, or every time you want to change the zoning or layout of your lighting. Whereas with DALI, it's really a robust system that just keeps going and going and going. And per the argument, Europe has a lot more older buildings than North America does per average. And as a result, you're constantly retrofitting those spaces. And so to have that as the case study right there, yes, DALI can be used for pretty much the majority of luminaire applications, if not all luminaire applications. I know there are going to be a lot of people who push back on that statement, but, from what we've talked about here, having this system available as a tool and not just as an afterthought or as I guess we could have done DALI, really kind of motivates that design at the beginning of a project, so that you can really go, okay, yeah, well, we don't need to think about zoning so much right now. We just need to think about what we're doing with the lights. We're laying out the light design. They're all going to be DALI. So if we need to reassign how they're operating with each other, we'll figure that out later during programming, as opposed to we need to figure that out, how we're circuiting everything and how we're powering everything. And so a lot of what DALI has been doing lately has been trying to create better standards and better expectations for the functionality, but it's still the same technology, it's still the same installation requirements. Nothing has really changed overall with the system. So D4I is not like, the thing that you need to go, this is old DALI, we can't do that. It's more of that, okay, going forward, everybody agrees that these are the minimum things we need to have programmed, but it's not that it's anything new or different about the system. It sounds like there's stuff on the horizon when it comes to wireless, but that's a whole other can of worms that we can absolutely have you back on to talk about. But, really, there's just so many misconceptions about DALI that we really need to challenge in this industry, in North America, whenever we hear them, instead of just reinforcing them, because of the fact that this sort of thing is not going to get adopted if we just keep pushing that misconception down the road and accepting it for what we think it is. I really think that there's a lot of potential with DALI, and I talk about DALI in a lot of different ways, and certainly there are challenges to overcome in our industry, but they're the same challenges that most lighting control systems need to overcome. And it's just more of that. I would say DALI, unfortunately, isn't also ran in North America rather than the other groups that came first and got their footprint established. But DALI is an equally acceptable and functional system, and again, it's used everywhere else pretty ubiquitously. So it's not something we should really shrug off anymore. It's something we should really strongly consider and keep in mind when we're designing our lighting control systems.
Right. And yeah, so I just want to thank you. I really appreciate the ability to, open up to the audience. The North America region, it's really important to us. I spoke earlier about investing in the resource, and we really have done that. We've been listening to the pain points, understanding them, seeing what we can do to improve the situation. North America as a region is really important to us, and so we're taking it seriously and driving that resource into the region to support that. The push as well as the pull. So, appreciate the time on the webcast, the podcast today to talk to that amazing audience that you have. And thanks very much to you guys for some really great questions.
Awesome. Yeah, Paul, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on. And to our listeners, DALI's not such a bad four-letter word, right? We don't have to be so afraid of it. I don't want our listeners to take away that. I don't want their one takeaway to be that DALI is old, right? Because I want everyone to remember, everyone listen, DMX is old. 0 to 10 is old. These are not, right? We've all had project issues with DMX. The drivers couldn't respond because the DMX speed was too fast and you couldn't change it at your controller. You had 0 to 10 issues, whether it was syncing or sourcing, and someone didn't know what it was. You got 277 back down your 0 to 10 line and you fried the board. We've all had project issues in the past. DALI's not something to be afraid of. It's something that we should be looking at trying to adopt and bring into the US market, so that we can start to expand interoperability between systems and start to move things forward. So I just want everyone to remember that and not just hear that one word, and know that, the DALI Alliance is there to support you and your projects and use them as a resource. So I really thank you for coming on today. It was a great conversation. We'll definitely have to have you come back to talk about the wireless, because I'm sure that's going to intrigue a lot of people as well. So thank you again. And I just want to take a minute to remind everyone, today's episode was presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. Check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com. It has all of our episodes, a news feed for the industry, as well as merch if you want to support the podcast. And additionally, check out NYC Controlled. It's coming up this November in New York City. It's a great conference, brand new to the market, and should be full of lots of interesting conversations, presentations, and products to review. So definitely check it out. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. And Paul, really appreciate it. This was really cool.